Perhaps you are watching this story from a bright room in front of a glowing screen, where wind and ice are nothing more than distant ideas. But if you look closely, you will see that the distance between the Vikings on Greenland and us today is not as great as it seems. They believed the world could be conquered with enough strength, enough will, enough faith. So do we. We build cities in deserts, launch satellites into the sky, and proudly declare that we have conquered nature. Yet when storms rise, when the seas climb higher, when the earth warms degree by degree, we tremble just like they once did. Erik the Red once believed he could create a Greenland in the middle of the frozen sea. And we today are building our own artificial paradise on a planet growing hotter every day. Both are beautiful. Dangerous illusions, dreams we invent to forget how small we truly are. The Vikings of Greenland did not die because they were weak. They died because they forgot that nature does not need mankind. And if there is one lesson they left behind, it is a quiet but profound reminder. The true strength of humanity does not lie in conquering nature, but in learning to listen and live in harmony with it. When we see the Arctic ice melting today, imagine this. Beneath those cold waters lie the ashes of Viking villages, the dreams of a people who once believed they could live forever in snow. They are gone. Yet their voices still whisper through the wind. Remember, every civilization has its own winter. And perhaps Greenland, the Greenland that never truly existed, is a mirror held up to all of humanity, that in our search for life, we are still walking the same path as Erik the Red, still chasing the distant horizon, still whispering to ourselves that there is a green land waiting beyond, and still refusing to see that the real ice we must conquer is the one frozen inside us. In this modern world, perhaps the simplest prayer is not for victory, but for humility, for the grace to bow before the vastness of the world we live in. Because sometimes, the greatest lesson of history is nothing more than a whisper carried on a cold wind. Do not repeat the wind sweeps through Greenland's fjords, whispering between the ruins of turf houses long collapsed. Beneath the deep ice, the white bones of the Vikings lie still. No names, no markers, only a silence vast as the land itself. No one knows the exact day their story ended. Perhaps it was the winter of 1410, when the last ship sailed from Brattahlid, or a century later, when the final priests stopped ringing the church bell because there were no souls left to hear it. All that remains are fragments, sheep bones, embroidered wool, wooden crosses, rusted blades, and a single question: why did they disappear? Some say it was the ice that killed them. Others believe they left, sailing west to Canada or merging with the Inuit. But nearly all agree on one thing. They did not die because they were weak. They died because they would not change. The Vikings brought to Greenland the culture of Europe, its laws, its faith, its pride, and its belief in eternal order. But they never realized that nature has no use for order. When the ice came, those laws became burdens. When the sea changed its currents, their old beliefs became chains. And so, they perished, not from hunger, nor from cold, but from loyalty to their own way of life. If you walk across that land today, you can still see the marks of human hands on stone, where they once tried to sow seed, light fire, and raise walls. Beneath the moss lies ash, the ash of old hearths, the ash of dreams that once burned bright at the edge of the world. The Viking souls are gone, but their story still murmurs in the wind, a wordless song of pride and of limits. We lived where no one dared to go. We built homes where the earth turned to ice. We defied both God and the sea, and if we failed, at least we failed standing. From Erik the Red, the outlaw who built a kingdom of frost, to his last descendants, who fell in the snow still clutching their wooden crosses, they wrote a chapter of history, both magnificent and tragic. And when we look back, we understand. The Middle Ages, with all its strange laws, fanatic faith, and desperate will to survive, was never madness. It was simply human instinct in its purest form, trying to make sense of chaos, to build order against the dark, to believe that meaning could exist within fear. But at the edge of that world, in Greenland, where ice and stone became one, the Vikings proved the opposite, that no law is strong enough to conquer nature, and no faith proud enough to stop mankind from shivering before the cold. Yet in that frozen defeat lies something sacred, the will to survive, the spark that makes us human. Their story is over, but its echo still drifts through the northern wind. And if you stand on a frozen Greenland fjord on a silent night, you may hear, faintly, the clang of Viking hammers, the laughter of children, and the voice of a red-bearded man calling the wind westward. Greenland was never a green land, but it became something far greater, a monument to human courage, to the will to create life where life should not exist. A century had passed since Erik the Red first set foot on Greenland. The two Viking settlements, the eastern and western colonies, once full of life, now lay wrapped in a strange silence. The church bells still rang, but each year their sound grew fainter, thinner, as if dissolving into the frozen wind. The climate had changed. Around the year 1200, the Little Ice Age began tightening its grip on the North Atlantic. Temperatures fell, ice pushed southward, seas froze earlier and thawed later. Ships from Iceland could no longer reach the harbors as before. Contact with Europe faded away. The Vikings of Greenland, who had survived by trade, were slowly cut off from the world. The grass no longer grew fast enough to feed the herds. The whales migrated farther south to warmer waters. And through the long winters, snow piled so high it buried the roofs. Food ran out. Cattle died by the dozens. People were forced to boil leather, eat roots, and grind bones into soup. Some tried fishing through the ice, but the sea had hardened like iron. Hunger and cold became Greenland's new gods, merciless beyond prayer. Then came their new neighbors, the Inuit. They arrived from the north, hunters wrapped in furs, carrying tools carved from whalebone, and a skill the Vikings never learned, the art of living with the ice. At first, the two groups traded, ivory for meat and skins. But tension soon followed. The Vikings saw them as savages, refusing to live as they did. And the Inuit called the pale-haired strangers kavlunate, foolish people in cloth, dying in the cold. In one of the last letters ever sent from a Greenland church to Norway, a priest wrote, "We die slowly from hunger. The sea gives no fish, the earth gives no grass. We pray, but it seems the Lord has forgotten this land." The Vikings clung to their Norse pride to the very end. They refused to eat raw fish. They refused to wear seal fur. They refused to skip Mass even when snow covered the church roof. Even starving, they still wore wool, cloth that trapped no warmth in the -10 winds. Archaeology tells the story of their final days. At Herjolfsnes, bodies were found carefully buried in embroidered robes, hands clasping wooden crosses. No wounds, no blood, only death by cold, in silence and faith. Ruined churches, moss-covered stones, cattle bones split open for marrow, all proof of a civilization defeated not by war, but by nature. When European ships returned to Greenland in the 15th century, they found no one, no voices, no smoke, only broken houses and a land of ice. The Vikings had vanished, their bodies folded into the frozen ground, their voices lost to the wind. And yet, their legend endured. The Inuit told of red-haired spirits walking the snow in dreams. European chronicles called them the lost people, those who dared to build homes at the edge of the world. The story of Greenland ends as a warning that there are places humankind cannot conquer, not with strength, courage, or faith. And sometimes, the greatest sin is pride, the belief that we can master nature itself. Yet within that tragedy lies something beautiful. Amid the ice, the Vikings proved that humans can still live, love, and hope in a place where only death seems possible. And when they vanished, they left behind the one treasure every civilization longs for, the trace of courage. When the storms finally passed, the Vikings looked around their new home, and they understood immediately that nothing here would be easy. No forests to build with, no soft soil to farm, no plains, and no true summer. Greenland, the land of Erik the Red, was cold, dry, and bare. But because of that, it forced them to become inventors of survival. And like all Viking people, they did not retreat. They learned how to build houses from the earth itself. With no timber, they used turf and grass, cutting them into blocks like bricks and stacking them into thick walls. Inside, they built frames from driftwood, tree trunks carried by the sea from as far away as Canada or Siberia, gifts from the gods themselves. The walls were nearly a yard thick, the roof layered with moss and grass, and in the center burned a small hearth that never went out through the long winter. Those homes, turf houses, still leave traces today. From afar, they seem to merge with the land, as if the Vikings had not built houses on the earth, but had become part of it. Inside, life was tight and dim, almost like living underground. The doors were low, there were no windows, only small openings covered with animal hide to let in a faint light. By day, the air was thick with smoke from the hearth. By night, the whole family, parents, children, even young livestock, slept together for warmth. Breaths mixed in the dark, the smell of smoke, wool, milk, and skin. A heavy perfume of survival. They planted grass on their roofs to fight the cold and feed their animals. They dried fish, salted meat with sea brine, and smoked it over peat fires. Women wove cloth, men hunted seals and reindeer, and children played in the mist, learning to hold a knife before they could speak. Summer was short, the sun shining all night, and everyone raced against time to gather food for winter. Because once the ice returned, Greenland became a prison of snow. Erik the Red, now the chieftain of the colony, ruled from Brattahlid, a grand hall by the fjord. People called him Erik the Red of Greenland, the founder, the settler, the living symbol of Norse endurance. Under his leadership, two main settlements took shape. The eastern settlement, the larger one, with grazing land and a harbor. The western settlement, smaller and colder, hidden deep in the mountains. Despite the harshness, for the first few decades, life there truly worked. Milk, cheese, furs, bones, walrus ivory, all became valuable exports. Trading ships from Iceland still arrived now and then, bringing iron, timber, wine, and news from the world they had left behind. At the edge of the world, the Vikings rebuilt a miniature Scandinavia. They had chieftains, councils, and laws. They celebrated Yule in winter, drank mead, and sang of Odin, Freya, and the gods of their homeland. A phrase recorded from that time reads, "We found a new world, not to live easily, but to live freely." And perhaps, as the fire flickered against the freezing Greenland wind, Erik the Red knew that though he had named this place Greenland to deceive others, it was he who had been deceived. For the land was not green, but it had become the place he loved and the place where he would die. After the first harsh years, the Viking colony in Greenland slowly found its rhythm, a slow, unyielding rhythm, steady as stone. From the turf houses rising along the fjords, a tiny society took shape, a frozen miniature of Scandinavia adrift in the Arctic Ocean. Every Viking household was a world unto itself. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats, though keeping the herds alive through winter was a nightmare. Their food stores were hard cheese, curdled milk, dried meat, and salted fish. Men went on long hunting voyages, for seals, whales, even polar bears. They rowed across frozen fjords, spears in hand, to battle creatures so massive that a single strike of the tail could kill a man. Each seal caught meant survival for months, its hide, flesh, and fat providing fuel, food, and light for the dark season. Women were the heart of the settlement. Inside those dim, crowded homes, they wove wool, made cheese, kept the fire, and raised children. The clack of looms echoed all day, not just to make clothing, but to produce vadmal, coarse woolen cloth that became the colony's currency. Vadmal was traded for iron, timber, and salt brought by ships from Iceland. The Vikings in Greenland also carried with them their laws and their gods. They held assemblies, the Thing, where chieftains sat on stones to settle disputes over land, grazing rights, or blood feuds. There were no prisons, only compensation, exile, or revenge. Justice in Greenland balanced on the thin edge between life and death, because no one could survive alone here. Religion began to change as well. At first they still worshipped Odin, Thor, and Freya, the Norse gods who had sailed with them across the sea. But by the early 11th century, Christianity had reached the north. Some merchant ships brought priests, and slowly, the cross replaced Thor's hammer. Small stone churches appeared, roofs covered with grass and ice, bells roughly cast, crosses carved from walrus ivory. Even Erik the Red, who once mocked the new faith, watched as his wife, Theodhild, built her own chapel and demanded silence when she prayed. From that act came Theodhild's church, the first Christian church in the Americas. When summer arrived and the ice melted, trade ships from Iceland returned to the fjords. They brought news, timber, and iron, and in return took ivory, furs, and wool. Each time a ship appeared, the villagers gathered at the shore as if for a festival. They heard stories of the kings of Norway, wars in Europe, and fishing seasons in the North Sea, winds of another world blowing into this forgotten one. But beneath the fragile peace, danger was gathering. The air grew colder, winters longer, snow fell earlier. Cattle died in droves, pastures vanished, and contact with Europe faded. The Vikings did not know it yet, but above their frozen skies, what historians would later call the Little Ice Age had begun, and it would slowly extinguish their flame on Greenland. But that is a story for later, when Norse pride must face a cold that no courage could conquer. For now, inside the turf houses, with storms howling outside, the Vikings still sit by the hearth, raise their mead, and sing. Though the ice may swallow the world, the North still keeps its fire within the heart. Summer of the year 985 AD. Along the western coast of Iceland, fog hangs thick, the sea black as ink, and 25 longships wait silently for the wind. Each one is packed with families, livestock, seeds, tools, and a fragile faith that somewhere to the west, beyond the known world, lies a Greenland waiting for them. At the head of the fleet stands Erik the Red, his fiery hair and beard glowing like the very flame that made him both famous and feared. No longer an exile, Erik is now a leader, a navigator, a salesman of hope to those who have nothing left to lose. The voyage begins to the rhythm of oars and the howl of the wind through shields and ropes. But within days, the sea turns against them. A storm rises from the north, the wind shrieking like drowned souls. Waves strike their faces, salt burns their skin, and ships light as feathers are tossed between walls of water. The Viking men, born in storms, keep rowing and singing, their voices echoing through thunder, part rhythm, part defiance. The women wrap their children in sheepskins and pray to both Odin and Christ, unsure which god might still be listening. Food begins to rot. The barrels of fresh water run low. Many ships vanish into the mist, crushed by ice or swept away by currents. Some turn back, defeated. But more than 14 ships push onward, because turning back means starving, while sailing forward, however blind, still means a chance to live. After many weeks, when hope is nearly gone, the horizon begins to change color. Through the fog appear mountains capped with ice and cliffs rising straight from the sea. The shore gleams silver gray, waves bursting into cold spray. Greenland, the land of promise. But instead of meadows, They find only rock, snow, and a silence so deep it hurts. The Vikings step onto the shore, kneel, and kiss the frozen ground, torn between joy and despair. One man whispers, "Not green, but at least not sea." Erik the Red stands above them and smiles. The smile of a man who knows he has sold a dream, yet somehow made it real. Under his command, families pitch tents, slaughter livestock, light fires, and turn that mute, lifeless coast into the first Viking refuge in Greenland. They name the place Brattahlid, the steep slope, where the land dips gently toward a clear fjord that mirrors the ice. From here, Erik rules as a chieftain, while other families spread out to build two main settlements, the eastern and western Greenland colonies. But behind their triumph lies brutal truth. No forest for timber, no iron for tools, no fertile soil for crops. They survive on hay, milk, salted meat, and the sea. Winter descends like a curse, and the Vikings realize that their enemies are no longer men. Their enemies are nature itself, hunger, cold, and isolation. And yet, upon that frozen rock, a community is born, not because the land is kind, but because their will to live is stronger than death. Houses of turf and stone rise, smoke mingling with mist. Children laugh, dogs bark, and the hammer rings out against the wind. Erik the Red deceived the world, but his lie became a legacy. The story of humankind reaching the edge of the earth and surviving. Every great tragedy begins with someone cast out. For Erik the Red, that was literally true. Around the year 982 AD in Iceland, Erik became tangled in a chain of bloody feuds, killing, revenge, and more killing still. Under Viking law, once blood was spilled, there were only two options: vengeance or exile. Erik was chosen as the sacrifice for peace. He was outlawed, declared outside the protection of the law. No one could feed him, no one could shelter him, and if someone killed him, no punishment would follow. But instead of dying in the frozen wasteland, Erik looked west. Fishermen had spoken of a distant, misty land where wind and ice collided, a pale shadow beyond the ocean. For most, it was the edge of the world. For Erik, it was an opportunity. He built a ship, gathered a few desperate companions, packed what little food they had, and set sail from Iceland across what the Norse called the Whale Road. After many days adrift through fog and drifting ice, they saw land, white cliffs, barren slopes, and ground so cold that steel froze on contact. No forests, no fields, only rock and ice. A normal man would have turned back. But Erik was not normal. He understood that sometimes survival requires a lie. When he returned to Iceland, he told everyone about a beautiful, fertile land with green meadows and mild weather, a place he called Greenland. The name was a stroke of marketing genius, centuries ahead of its time. Erik knew that if he called it the frozen wastes, no one would come. But Greenland, that sounded like a promise, a dream, a paradise. And he needed people, settlers to build farms, raise families, and make his dream real. His story spread across the island. Farmers worn down by Iceland's rocky soil, outcasts seeking a new start, dreamers chasing fortune, all heard the call. And in 985 AD, the greatest Viking expedition of its age set sail. 25 ships filled with people, livestock, seeds, tools, and hope. The voyage was long and deadly. Whirlwinds, blizzards, and icebergs crushed hulls. Many ships vanished into the sea, never to be seen again. But those who survived, about 14 vessels, finally reached the white land Erik had promised. There were no green meadows, only stone, snow, and an iron-gray sky. But they were there now, at the edge of the world, with no way back. And so, from a lie, a Viking colony was born, the most remote human settlement of the 10th century. No trees, no fertile earth. No help coming, and yet they called it home. From this point on, the story changes direction. No more kings, No more churches or laws, only humans and nature, locked in a battle for every breath. What Erik began with a lie, his descendants would continue with sheer will to survive. They would learn to build houses from ice, grow grass on stone, hunt seals, and endure winters that lasted nearly half a year. Greenland, a land born from a lie but kept alive by truth, the strength of those who refused to surrender. And this was only the beginning of a long journey, the journey where the Vikings turned the end of the world into the final mark of their age. If you have listened this far, you are probably thinking, the Middle Ages were insane. No dressing up, no meat, no bathing, no working, no questioning. Every breath of life chained by strange decrees, so strict that even breathing at the wrong time could be a sin. But before we laugh at them, ask yourself this. Why did such absurd laws last for centuries without collapsing? The answer lies in one harsh truth of history. They were necessary. The Middle Ages were an age of chaos and fear. Disease, famine, war, and bandits all could end your life in a single day. When there was no science, no administration, laws became the only glue holding society together. Fasting laws preserved the food supply. Dress codes maintained class boundaries, preventing envy from turning into revolt. Curfew laws saved villages from burning to ash. The Sabbath forced workers to rest when they would never allow themselves to. And the brutal punishments, trial by fire, duels, executions, were the only language the people believed in. The medieval world did not crave freedom. It craved stability. And within that stability, the first stones of modern Europe were quietly laid. Look at the larger design. The church controlled time with its bells. The guilds controlled labor. The laws controlled behavior. The king controlled the land. Each cog turned with the others, creating a system where order mattered more than justice. It may have been a prison, but it was the safest prison humanity could build at the time. And yet not everyone agreed to live behind those walls. Far to the north, another people were rising, wilder, braver, freer than anyone in Europe. They feared no law, heeded no bell. They lived by the wind, the waves, and the sword. While Europe knelt in its churches, they were already sailing across frozen seas. While peasants trembled before their lords, they challenged kings with axes and fire. The people of the Middle Ages believed justice belonged to God. They, the Vikings, believed justice lay in the sword held in their own hands. In the 10th century, as dogma tightened its grip on Europe, a man in the far north was exiled for murder. Instead of dying in banishment, he discovered a new land, a land he named Greenland, though it was nearly all ice. That man was Erik the Red, cast out from human society, yet founder of another. And from here, our story leaves behind the dark walls of Europe to drift across the cold sea, where wind howls through the masts and waves rise like mountains. A new chapter of history begins, the chapter of those who sought freedom in the heart of the storm. So let us silence the church bells, forget the salted fish and the iron laws, because from the next part onward, we will leave the old continent behind. And with the Viking ships, sail toward the white horizon, where there are no laws, only the sea and survival. You sit in a dim tavern, the air thick with cheap wine and wood smoke, the familiar scent of every medieval town. At your table, a few men are grumbling about how the village priest has started charging more for blessings. You laugh and say, maybe even God has to pay taxes to him now. That one sentence, meant as a joke, could be enough to send you to the stake. In the Middle Ages, blasphemy and heresy were not merely sins against religion. They were crimes against God himself, acts of treason in a kingdom ruled jointly by church and crown. A mocking word, a doubtful comment, even sitting in silence during a sermon could summon you before the ecclesiastical court. That court was unlike any other. There were no lawyers, no public witnesses, only priests in black robes, a crucifix, and a thick ledger. They did not question you to understand. They questioned you to make you contradict yourself, until your own words became evidence of guilt. "Do you believe that the holy bread is truly the body of Christ?" they would ask. If you said no, you were a heretic. If you hesitated, you were doubting the faith. If you stayed silent, you were defying the church. And so every path led to guilt. Those found guilty of minor offenses might be whipped, shamed in public, or forced to wear a cone-shaped penitent's hat, the San Benito, embroidered with demons. The greater offenders were burned alive. To the church, the fire was not simply punishment. It was a purifying flame for the soul. Chroniclers described it with horror and reverence. They prayed while the condemned screamed. Death by fire was both cruel and sacred. People believed that through agony, the soul would be cleansed of sin. The most famous case was Joan of Arc, a French peasant girl who claimed to hear the voice of God calling her to fight. When she triumphed, she was praised as heaven's messenger. When captured, the same men who once worshipped her charged her with heresy, cross-dressing, and consorting with the devil. In 1431, she was burned at the stake in Rouen. Witnesses said that when the flames died, her heart remained unburned. But even that miracle could not save her. Why was the church so ruthless? The answer was simple and cold: control. Faith was not just belief. It was the foundation of power. If one person could question the truth, the entire order could collapse. Every throne, every title, every coin of authority began with the words, "By the will of God." If people stopped believing, kings lost legitimacy, nobles lost status, the church lost its taxes, and the whole system would crumble like sand. So they punished to make others fear. Public burnings became grand spectacles. Crowds gathered as if for a festival, bringing bread, beer, even children. The bells rang, the priest recited prayers, and the fire roared, part holy ritual, part political theater. Sometimes people were condemned simply for owning forbidden books, a mistranslated Bible, a Greek philosophy text, or a few handwritten pages of dissent, all called teachings of the devil. They burned books, they burned people, they burned memory itself, anything to keep the world quiet in perfect faith. Imagine yourself standing in that crowd, watching the flames climb the wooden stake, hearing both the screams and the prayers. In that moment, you cannot tell who is truly being punished, the one burning, or the ones convinced they are saved by the fire. Because in the Middle Ages, one wrong word could cost you your life, but silence too long could cost you your soul. The church bells ring again, but this time, they do not call the living to prayer. They call the dead to the earth. A funeral passes through the village. 4 men carry a wooden stretcher draped with coarse cloth, the scent of pine resin mixing with damp soil. But if you look closely, you notice one detail that says everything. The stretcher is not heading toward the churchyard. The dead will not be buried in consecrated ground. In medieval Europe, death did not end your story. It began a new chapter in the hierarchy of faith. To be buried in holy ground meant your soul was under God's protection. Those denied it, whether wicked or innocent, were doomed to wander between worlds. Those buried in the churchyard were faithful believers, absolved of sin. But the list of those refused was long and merciless. Suicides, for they had rejected God's gift of life. Executed criminals, the excommunicated, women who died pregnant out of wedlock, and sometimes victims of plague seen as punished by God. They were laid to rest on the outskirts of the village, where the soil was dry and no crosses marked the graves. The earth was thrown over them hastily, with no names carved. Centuries later, when the ground was dug up, their bones were still found tangled in the mud, as if no one had ever mourned them. Meanwhile, the church cemetery, God's land, was as crowded as a market. The rich paid to be buried close to the altar, believing that proximity to holiness would hasten their ascent to heaven. The poor were buried along the walls. During plague years, graves were reused. Old coffins were dug up to make space for new ones. The sacred ground was small. The dead were endless. Eventually, monks opened charnel pits, mass graves filled with hundreds of bodies. When full, the bones were gathered and taken to the ossuary, arranged into crosses and stacked into walls. Step into one of those churches, and you would see human bones forming the very foundation of the altar. Death was not hidden here. It was part of the sacred scenery. In 14th century records, a grim practice appears. When families secretly buried someone outside holy ground near a church, the body would be exhumed. The act was called cleansing the soil. In some places, bodies were burned to return the soul to God, though cremation itself was forbidden. But the true tragedy was this: even death had a social class. A poor man, gentle all his life, could still be denied a final resting place because he could not afford to buy a burial. The church charged burial dues, payment for prayers, candles, and funeral masses. Without it, the priest would not accept the body. To avoid being buried in a forsaken field, many poor people saved their entire lives just to purchase a respectable death. Some were buried with a few coins and a note reading, "For the grave digger, so I will not be thrown by the fence." Yet there were acts of mercy. Some monasteries, out of compassion, opened strangers' plots, burial grounds for the abandoned dead. The priest would whisper a short prayer, but it was enough for the deceased to be named. Today, when we hear memento mori, remember that you will die, we think of it as philosophy. For medieval people, it was a daily reality. They lived in the shadow of graveyards, dined with the scent of pine resin, and knew that their resting place after death was decided long before they stopped breathing, just like their station in life. You watch the funeral fade into the mist, the smoke of incense mixing with the morning fog. You think of your own death and wonder, when your time comes, will the earth take you in or reject you as a stranger? The quiet morning of your village is shattered by urgent knocking. 3 guards stand at your door, their faces covered with cloth, each holding a bucket of red paint. They do not need to say a word. You already know what is coming. One of them drives a wooden sign into the ground before your house. Domus clausus. The house is closed. Someone in your family has coughed up blood. That alone is enough. And by law, your whole household will be quarantined. No one goes out, no one comes in. The sick and the healthy, all waiting together. The idea of quarantine was born from the greatest fear of the Middle Ages, the Black Death. Beginning in the year 1347, the plague arrived on trading ships from the east and went on to wipe out more than 1/3 of Europe's population. No one understood how people who seemed healthy one day could fall ill the next. Their skin darkened, their bodies swollen, and death came within 3 days. Without knowing the cause, people turned to isolation. The city of Venice was the first to introduce 40 giorni, 40 days, for all arriving ships. Sailors had to remain aboard for 40 days before stepping onto land. The number 40 was not random. It came from the Bible. 40 days of the Great Flood, 40 days of Christ's temptation in the desert. To the medieval mind, 40 was the number of purification. But in the countryside, quarantine was far more brutal. Once your house was marked, the door was sealed shut, nailed from the outside. Villagers avoided your street, and children were forbidden to speak your name. From time to time, the plague warden would leave bread and water at your doorstep, your only link to the world beyond. And when the crying stopped, they would return only to carry out the bodies. In the cities, authorities created pest houses, grim buildings where the sick were gathered to die together. Streets stood empty, markets closed, priests moved door to door giving blessings through cracks in the wood, while funeral bells tolled without end. People burned incense, wore herbal garlands, and donned the infamous beaked masks stuffed with spices, believing these would block the poisoned air. Before long, the funeral bell became the sound of everyday life, so constant that no one flinched at it anymore. Those who survived later wrote, The village was so quiet it hurt. No plows, no barking dogs. Only the wind and the smell of ash. In some places, when the sick died behind locked doors, their bodies rotted inside sealed houses, and the doors were only reopened when no one was left alive to protest. Yet from that horror, a new idea of public health was born. For the first time, Europeans realized the need to contain disease at its source. Though they still knew nothing of bacteria, they began building quarantine stations, controlling trade routes, and requiring health certificates for ships and merchants. In Milan, the mayor Bernabo Visconti decreed, "Anyone who hides their illness shall be executed." Cruel, but it saved the city from the worst of the plague. In England, officials appointed watchmen to patrol the streets at night, noting every cough, every candle still burning past curfew. And in small, illiterate villages, people invented their own language of plague. A red cross painted on a door meant, "Do not enter." A fresh green branch in the window meant, "Still alive." And when that branch dried out, everyone knew what it meant. You stand inside your sealed house, a thread of light slipping through the crack in the door. Outside, life continues. People farm, fish, pray. Inside, you hear only the wind scraping against the walls and the flies circling the bread you did not finish. In the darkness, you wonder, after 40 days, will the door open for the living, or only for those who come to collect the dead? Because in that world, quarantine was not merely a medical measure. It was a silent farewell ritual between humanity and the living world. It is an autumn morning. You open your old wooden chest and take out the finest piece of cloth you own, a small strip of blue silk, softer and brighter than the worn brown tunic you wear every day. You tell yourself, it is just a scarf. No one will notice. But the moment you step into the street, your neighbor's eyes fix on you. Then the whispers start. Another one dressing above their station. Congratulations, you have just broken the sumptuary laws. In medieval Europe, clothing was not fashion, it was social order. Every thread, every color, every inch of fabric was regulated by law. It was not only about maintaining hierarchy, but about protecting the dignity of the noble class. If you were a peasant, you were allowed to wear only coarse wool in brown, gray, or black, colors of humility. Anything bright, soft, or shiny was considered an insult to the order ordained by God. Even wealthy merchants had restrictions. No matter how full their chests of gold and silver were, they were forbidden from wearing silk, velvet, or ermine fur. Those were privileges of the titled elite, and purple was strictly forbidden. The dye, known as Tyrian purple, was extracted from rare sea snails and once reserved for Roman emperors. In England, only the king, the queen, and their children could wear it. To do otherwise meant fines, confiscation, or imprisonment. In Italy, where merchant wealth was rising fast, city laws went into absurd detail. Women could wear no more than 2 gold rings. Servants could not wear embroidered hems. Silk fabric was allowed only for those earning over 1,000 florins per year. In England, under King Edward III, these rules were written into the Statutes of Apparel, 1363. People were required to dress according to the station of their birth. If you were a simple weaver but dared to wear brocade, you were betraying the divine order. But the deeper reason was not just pride. The nobility feared that if commoners looked like them, social boundaries would blur. They feared walking into church and not knowing whom to bow to. They feared that merchants, rich through trade, not blood, could pretend to be noble, shaking the very foundation of inherited power. And so, fashion became a weapon of control. In the streets, there were wardens of apparel, officials who patrolled markets inspecting what people wore. They measured trims, felt fabrics, and checked colors. One man was caught for wearing cloth too fine for his rank. One young woman had her dress seized because its red was too bright, a color reserved for the wife of a magistrate. As for the nobles, they dressed like peacocks. Sleeves so long they needed servants to help them walk. Pointed poulain shoes stretching nearly to the knee, tied with cords to keep from tripping. Some gowns had trains several feet long, just to show that the wearer never had to work. Meanwhile, you, a peasant, owned only two garments, one for labor, one for burial, and if you dared to decorate your sleeve with a bit of lace, simply to feel beautiful for a day, the law would remind you of your place. Of course, people found ways to cheat. Some merchants secretly bought silk and dyed it dark to look poor. Some clever girls stitched a few hidden threads of gold inside their seams where no one could see. Fashion became a secret game between desire and prohibition. You return home and remove the blue scarf from your neck. The evening light filters through the window, making it shimmer for an instant before you fold it and hide it beneath the pile of old brown wool. You know that this one piece of fabric, in this world, is enough to make you a rebel. Because in the Middle Ages, the greatest crime was not hunger. It was daring to be different. You are used to the smell of sweat, mud, smoke, and livestock, the scent of the entire medieval world. But today, you have managed to save a few coins and decide you deserve a reward, a bath. You head to the public bathhouse, once the heart of every medieval town, where people gathered to talk, gossip, and sometimes find lovers. But when you arrive, a wooden sign hangs on the door, closed by order of the council. Bathing, once a simple, ordinary act, had been outlawed, because according to priests and officials, bathing is the shortest path to sin and disease. By the 14th century, as the Black Death swept across Europe, public bathhouses were condemned as breeding grounds of plague. People believed that hot steam opened the pores, allowing poisonous vapors and evil airs to invade the body. To make matters worse, many bathhouses doubled as brothels, linking cleanliness with lust. The result, those who bathe too often are sinful. So the bathhouses closed. People were forced back into the world of bathing at home, which really meant hauling cold water from a well, pouring it into a wooden tub, and scrubbing quickly with soap made from animal fat, when they could afford it. Everyone knew that bathing was a luxury. Most peasants simply wiped themselves with a damp cloth a few times a year, comforting themselves with the thought that God prefers a clean soul to a clean body. The nobles, of course, were different. Inside their castles, they had private bathing rooms with warm water, scented with rose petals, wine, or milk. They perfumed their bodies with oils and dried themselves with silk cloths. But in public, they pretended otherwise, because in that age of strict morality, being too clean was suspicious. Preachers warned in their sermons, bathing weakens the soul, for those who care too much for the body will forget the divine. And so, people bathed less and less, until the smell itself became part of Europe's identity. Arab travelers in the 12th century wrote, "The Franks do not bathe, nor change their clothes, and they treat water as a luxury. It was not just the poor, even kings avoided the tub." Louis XIV of France bathed only a handful of times in his life. He masked the odor with perfume, which later became a cultural weapon replacing soap. As the church came to fear the pleasures of water, people slowly accepted filth as normal. Some believed dirt formed a protective armor against disease. A 16th century English noblewoman even wrote in her diary, "I do not bathe in winter, lest my skin grow weak." Of course, some cities still kept secret bathhouses. In the dim candlelight, people would steam, talk, or simply let warm water touch their skin, a luxury so rare that some wept from joy. They bathed not only to be clean, but to remember that they were still human, not walking corpses that smelled of the grave. The ban on bathing might sound absurd now, but in that time it was a reflex born of fear and survival. When death moved invisibly from street to street, people chose filth as protection, or at least as hope. You walk away from the shuttered bathhouse as the rain begins to fall, soft and cold. You tilt your face upward, letting a few drops touch your skin, and smile faintly. Perhaps this is the only bath you are allowed, a small mercy from the sky, in an age when cleanliness was a sin. You do not own a clock. No one does. For people of the Middle Ages, time was not measured by hands and numbers. It was measured by bells. The church bell was the heartbeat of the entire world. It told you when to wake, when to pray, when to work, rest, eat, sleep, and sometimes when to be afraid. In any village of 13th century Europe, a bell was not just a sound, it was the law. At dawn, the bell rang for matins, the first prayer, marking the start of the day. The next, prime, came when the first light touched the rooftops. Time to go to the fields. By noon, sext, stop working, eat a crust of bread, drink a sip of water. As evening fell, vespers, put down your tools, return home, light the fire. At night, compline, the final prayer, and then all lights out. And so the life of a peasant flowed not by calendar or clock, but by the echo of bells rolling across the fields. If you worked too slowly, people said you were going against the bell. If you arrived late to Mass, everyone knew. The bell had rung, and you were not there. The bell was an invisible overseer of every soul, whispering the same reminder. Your time is not your own, it belongs to God. In the cities, the bells held even greater power. They ruled the order of society itself. One bell opened the market. Another closed the city gates. Others warned of fire, of invading soldiers, or of an execution about to take place. When plague swept through the streets, bells tolled for the dead. When a king died, they thundered for 3 days. Every life, its birth, its work, its death, was recorded by sound. But bells were also weapons of power. Whoever controlled the bells controlled time. The church decided when you could work, when you must kneel, and when you should sleep. It did not merely organize faith. It organized rhythm, obedience, and thought. People grew so used to it that they feared silence. If the bells failed to ring on time, they believed disaster was coming. Sickness, floods, or demons. In monasteries, monks were tasked with measuring hours by candles, watching how far the wax melted to strike the bells precisely. If one of them overslept, the whole brotherhood was punished. For God, even being late to prayer was a sin. In the 14th century, when the first mechanical clocks appeared on European bell towers, they did not set people free. Instead, they bound them more tightly. Where the bell had once been off by a few minutes, the clock left no room for error. From then on, Europe entered the age of punctuality, a concept born, ironically, from the church itself. Imagine standing in the middle of a field. The sun has not yet set, and you have just a few rows of wheat left to cut. Then, clang, clang, clang. A bell calls from afar, commanding you to stop, to lower your sickle, to lift your head and pray. You hesitate, hand still mid-motion, but everyone around you is already kneeling. No one dares to disobey. You bow too. In that moment you realize your life has no rhythm of its own. The bells have shaped everything, every breath, every meal, every prayer. And when the ringing fades and the wind rises again, you return to your work, knowing that before long it will sound once more, reminding you that even time itself does not belong to you. You decide you will not be a farmer anymore. Too much mud, too little to eat. You want a new life, to bake bread, forge swords, or weave cloth. But before you can even begin, everyone in the village tells you the same thing. Without the guild's permission, do not even dream of touching that hammer. That was the law of the guilds, organizations that were part school, part secret society, and part miniature government for every trade in medieval Europe. If you wanted to work as a blacksmith, weaver, shoemaker, or brewer, you had to belong to a guild. No one was allowed to work freely. Freedom was dangerous. Freedom was chaos, and chaos had no place in a world built on rank and order. Joining a guild was no easy feat. First, you had to become an apprentice. That meant years of cleaning, fetching, chopping wood, and watching, but never touching. You earned no wages, only food and shelter, and the hope that your master would not beat you too often. After several years, if you survived and proved skilled enough, you became a journeyman, allowed to travel and work for pay. but still bound by the guild's rules. To become a master, you had to pass the ultimate test, to create a flawless work known as a masterpiece. It had to prove your craft was worthy of the guild's name, a chair that did not wobble, a finely woven cloth, a perfectly risen loaf of bread, a sword without a single chip. If the masters approved, you were accepted, and only then could you open your own workshop. It sounds fair, but in truth, those already at the top rarely wanted newcomers climbing up. Many masters were so harsh that they rejected apprentices for vague reasons, to protect the honor of the craft, but also, conveniently, to protect their profits. The guild was a closed circle. It defended the trade, but it also guarded its gate. And yet, the guilds had their admirable side. They set quality standards, making sure bread was not mixed with sawdust, beer was not diluted with dirty water, and armor did not shatter in battle. They regulated prices to protect craftsmen from greedy merchants. They kept funds to support members in need, pay for funerals, help widows, and host festivals. In an age without insurance, the guild was the only safety net people had. Still, if you broke the rules, punishment was very real. Tried to open a forge without a license? The guild would storm in, smash your furnace, confiscate your tools, and blacklist you for life. In a world where survival depended on reputation, being banned from the trade meant being erased from society. One record from Paris tells of a baker accused of selling loaves below the required weight. The guild's verdict: he had to stand in the marketplace holding the offending loaf, wear a hat made of flour, and apologize to every passerby. When it was done, they destroyed his oven in front of the crowd. No blood spilled, but his career was over. Seen more broadly, the guild was an early form of the modern labor union, but infused with religious and social authority. Guilds marched beside the cross in processions, funded churches, and sometimes even held political influence. Some medieval mayors had once been master tailors or shoemakers, proof that skill could lift a person up, as long as they climbed the ladder properly. You look down at your calloused hands and wonder, will you ever be called a master? Probably not. But at least now you understand this. In the Middle Ages, work was not just a skill, it was a privilege. And to earn that privilege, you had to bow before those who held the guild's seal. Sunday morning. The church bells echo through the valley, deep and solemn, pulling the entire village out of sleep. You cannot ignore them. No matter how tired you are, no matter how your back aches after a week in the fields, today you must attend Mass, because if you do not, you will be punished. For the people of the Middle Ages, the Sabbath was not just a day off. It was a sacred law, carved into the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, which meant no work, no weaving, no plowing, no trading, no cooking, no washing. Everything had to stop, so that the soul could rest with God. It sounds peaceful, but the reality was far from it. The church strictly enforced this rule. The priest, along with the village guards, patrolled the markets, searching for anyone daring to sell vegetables or shoe a horse on a Sunday. If caught, you could be whipped, fined, or shamed publicly. In some towns, offenders were made to kneel in the square, holding a wooden sign that read, "Worked on the Lord's Day." The medieval world survived on manual labor. A forced day of rest could easily mean going hungry. Farmers struggled when harvest season came, but they were forbidden to reap. Craftsmen lost customers when their shops were closed. Yet the law was absolute. Even if your fields were flooding, you had to drop your plow. Even if the forge was still burning, you had to lay down your hammer. Still, beneath that strictness hid a rare kind of compassion. Church officials argued that if people worked without pause, their bodies and souls would break. The Sabbath, therefore, was both a commandment from God and a remedy for exhaustion, forcing people to rest when they could not bring themselves to stop. Inside the home, Women hurried to wash clothes and cook on Saturday night. On Sunday morning, everyone dressed as neatly as they could and walked together to church. Children were shy, elders hobbled along, but all fell silent when the priest raised his hands to pray. It was the one moment each week when the whole village lifted their heads and looked in the same direction. After Mass, the atmosphere changed. When the final amen echoed through the hall, the true day of rest began. People gathered outside the church gates to talk, trade goods, arrange marriages, or get drunk. In many places, Sunday worship quietly turned into a village fair, though officially it remained a holy day. Still, the church never truly relaxed its grip. It feared that if people rested too joyfully, they would forget the purpose of the Sabbath. Many monks and priests wrote stern letters warning parishioners against turning the sacred day into a worldly festival. In England, the later Blue Laws carried this spirit even further, banning card games, singing, and even playing football on Sundays. And so, rest became an obligation with a solemn face. Medieval people learned to obey even in the rare moments they were allowed to breathe. Yet look closer, and you might find something quietly profound. Among all the suffocating laws of the age, from bans on fine clothing, hunting, and meat, only the Sabbath commanded people to do something truly kind for themselves, to rest, to reflect, and to remember that they were human, not tools. So when evening falls and the final Sunday bell rings, you stand by the edge of the field, looking toward the distant wheat. Tomorrow, you will once again take up the plow and bow beneath the sun. But tonight, at least for this fleeting moment, God's law does not punish you. It protects you from your own exhaustion. You are accused of stealing a loaf of bread, a dry, fist-sized loaf, but enough to make the villagers point and whisper as the judge coldly calls your name before the crowd. You try to explain that your wife and children are starving, that you stole only out of desperation. But in the medieval world, truth did not lie in words. It lay in the hands of God. Let him decide, says the priest. And just like that, you are sentenced to an ordeal by divine judgment. The ordeal, a test by which the people of the Middle Ages believed God himself would reveal who was innocent and who was guilty. There were many forms of these ordeals, and none were merciful. The most common was the ordeal by fire. You were made to carry a red-hot iron bar, heavy and searing, and walk 3 steps without dropping it. Then your hand was wrapped in cloth. 3 days later, they would unwrap it. If the burn had healed cleanly, it meant God had protected you, and you were free. But if it festered or turned foul, you were guilty, and punishment awaited. Or you might face the ordeal by water. With your hands bound, you were thrown into a pond. If you sank, congratulations, you were pure, though probably dead. But if you floated, the water had rejected you, proving your guilt. In that case, the survivor was hanged. Divine justice, it seemed, was rarely gentle. In small villages, crowds gathered to watch these holy judgments, as if they were both sacred ceremonies and public spectacles. They believed the hand of God truly intervened, that in the flames or the freezing water, truth would reveal itself. And as you stood there, cold sweat running down your back, you realized that here, justice required no evidence, only luck. Some courts allowed trial by combat, ordeal by combat. 2 people fought with swords until one fell. The victor was chosen by God. If you were small, weak, or merely a peasant who had never held a blade, then, unfortunately, it seemed God always favored the one in armor. These ordeals survived for centuries because they served 2 convenient purposes. First, they kept people afraid, making them think God would personally punish the guilty. Second, they saved the authorities the trouble of investigating. When the accused had proven themselves through fire and blood, no one dared to question the verdict. Still, not everyone believed blindly. Many experienced priests quietly learned how to make the ordeal less cruel. They would heat the iron for a shorter time, sprinkle holy water to cool the flames, or have the accused lowered into shallow water instead of deep. What was called a miracle was often just a moment of human mercy. By the 13th century, the church officially banned these ordeals, realizing that proving guilt through blisters and burns was not true justice. Slowly, legal systems began to rely on testimonies, witnesses, and juries. But by then, thousands had died, believing God would protect the innocent. Imagine your own hand smoking, the smell of burnt flesh rising through the murmured prayers of the crowd. No one asks whether you actually took the bread. No one cares about the hunger. They only wait to see whether God will act in time to save you. And as you collapse, whispering, "Lord, have mercy," you finally understand. In this world, justice does not need reason, only suffering that looks holy enough. You are hungry, not the kind of casual hunger between meals, but the twisting, gut-wrenching kind that clouds your mind. For a whole week, your meals have been nothing but boiled cabbage and a few barley grains, so thin that you can see the spoon's reflection at the bottom of the pot. Then one evening, just as the sun begins to sink, you see it, a plump little rabbit with smooth gray fur hopping through the forest. A real dinner, just a few steps away. You hold your breath, grip your stick tight, and think, just one. Who would ever know? But cold reason, sharp as the winter wind, reminds you, none of the creatures in this forest belong to you. Not a single one. They all belong to the Lord. That was the law of the medieval world. Forests were not common land, but privileges of power. Even rabbits, deer, and wild boars were considered noble property. To kill one without permission, even to feed your starving family, was the crime of poaching, and the punishment could be far worse than you imagine. The penalties came in every form. The mild ones meant fines or confiscation of your tools. The harsh ones meant mutilation, hanging, or exile. In England, after the year 1066, when the forest law was established by the Norman kings, the royal forests became sacred domains of the crown. There, the deer was a symbol of royal authority, and killing one was seen as an offense against the king himself. But the common people saw the forest differently. To them, it was life itself. Firewood to stay warm, berries, mushrooms, herbs, and sometimes a meal that kept them alive. Yet the law made no distinction. Even gathering fallen branches could be called theft without official permission. That injustice turned the poorest peasants into criminals simply for trying to survive. Records tell of a farmer executed for trapping birds in a monastery's woods. Another man was blinded for accidentally killing a prince's deer. Such punishments were not just meant to deter. They were reminders that the forest was no place for common folk. Still, there were always those willing to risk it. When your stomach is empty, fear loses its meaning. Many nights, villagers slipped into the forest with nets, clubs, or snare lines. They moved like ghosts, crouching in bushes, listening for the distant baying of hounds. For them, every rabbit caught was a victory, not just over hunger, but over injustice itself. Those poachers became legends. In stories whispered around fires, they were heroes of the night, nameless Robin Hoods who risked their lives to bring food home to their people. Children listened in awe, dreaming of growing up brave enough to do the same, though everyone knew most such tales ended with a rope swinging beneath an oak tree. Ironically, while the poor risked death for a single rabbit, the nobles slaughtered hundreds of deer just to display their power. Their hunts were grand political spectacles, horns blaring, hounds charging, archers in formation. They did not hunt to eat, but to prove ownership of the land itself. That world ran on hypocrisy. One man could be executed for stealing a rabbit, while another was celebrated for killing an entire herd. And between those two extremes lay countless lives crushed beneath the cold weight of the law. You watch the rabbit hop deeper into the dark woods, your stomach growling like thunder. You tighten your grip on the stick, then let it fall. Not because you fear death, but because you know that in this world, Even that small creature understands its place better than you do. This morning, you wake up with your stomach growling so loudly it feels like you could swallow the wooden ladle on the table. All you can think about is meat, a slab of roasted pork, crispy and golden, or a bowl of rich, hearty beef stew. But then reality hits you. Today is Friday, the Lord's Day. And like every other Friday, meat is off the table. In the medieval world, that was not just a moral choice. It was the law. The church banned meat on hundreds of days each year, every Friday, all of Lent, Advent, and countless feast days. Nearly half the calendar was marked red with fasting days, turning ordinary people into reluctant experts at cooking salted fish. You glance into the cooking pot, and just as you feared, salted herring. Again. Yesterday, the day before, and probably for the next week too. The sharp, briny smell rising from the cold hearth makes you wonder if God truly wants you to suffer like this. Yet behind that veil of religion lay a clever system of survival. The church preached that fasting purified the soul and built patience. But for lords and rulers, it was also a way to control food supplies. Cows were not just food. They were plows, sources of milk, and leather. If peasants slaughtered them freely every time they were hungry, agriculture itself would collapse before winter came. By forcing people to eat fish on designated days, society preserved its draft animals, its breeding stock, and its hides for shoes, saddles, and armor. A clever economic policy wrapped in a holy excuse. The fasting menu of the poor was basically a list of failed experiments: dried herring, brackish waterfish, oatcakes, and boiled beans. The rich, however, had their own way of obeying, creatively. They made mock meat from almonds, or simmered fish in wine seasoned with expensive spices like cinnamon and cloves. Some even prepared a dish called chicken fish, a fish cooked to look exactly like roasted chicken, just to prove that even when fasting, they could still feast. Of course, not everyone was that devout. Many secretly ate meat behind locked doors. In some villages, people joked that the smell of roasted meat during Lent was the fragrance of sin itself. But if caught, the punishment was very real: fines, public labor, or being made to stand barefoot in the church for hours to repent. Merchants, meanwhile, seized the opportunity. Fish markets sprouted like mushrooms near rivers and lakes. The fishing industry boomed, creating vast trade networks for salt preservation. Many monasteries grew wealthy from raising fish in artificial ponds, turning monastic life into a self-sustaining economy. In England, Scotland, and across the Baltic, salted fish became a second form of currency, traded on par with barley and cloth. Fasting days, therefore, were not just symbols of faith. They were the backbone of the medieval economy. From the dull, salted herring on a peasant's table to the rich, almond-stewed eel at a noble's feast, everything moved to the rhythm the church commanded. It was a strange symphony of religion, agriculture, and survival. You swallow the last bite of salty fish, bones crunching between your teeth. Outside, the church bell tolls, measuring the patience of the entire village. You think of the cows chewing grass in their stalls, healthy, plump, alive, surviving thanks to your own hunger. And in that moment, you understand what many in the medieval world must have realized. God's law did not just protect your soul. It kept the entire economy from falling apart. Dusk has just fallen. You sit by the fireplace, savoring a rare bit of warmth after a long day in the rain, your cracked hands stretched out to catch the faintest sparks of heat. The house is silent, broken only by the soft crackle of burning wood. And then, clang. The bell tolls from the church tower, heavy, steady, and mournful, echoing like the heartbeat of the entire town. No, that is not the bell for Mass, nor the signal for dinner. It is the curfew bell, from the old French word couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. When the bell rang, there was only one thing everyone had to do: extinguish the fire, snuff out the candles, and let the darkness swallow them whole. You pick up a shovel, scoop up ashes, and cover the glowing embers until no trace of orange light remains. The house sinks into pitch-black silence, holding only the faint warmth trapped in the brick. If you were caught with any light after the bell, do not expect just a warning. The city law could fine you, or even have you whipped. A single stray spark could set the entire village ablaze, and the authorities never trusted poor folks to be careful enough to prevent it. The logic on the surface made sense. Most homes back then had straw roofs, wooden walls, and floors strewn with dry hay, all as flammable as tinder in winter. One tilted candle, one falling coal, and the entire street could become a sea of fire. In medieval London or Paris, house fires were as common as rainy seasons, and each one claimed dozens of lives. So the rulers believed that fear, not faith, was the only way to keep the flames under control. But, as with most rules, the curfew applied only to the poor. Nobles lived in solid stone castles with servants to watch the fires. They sat comfortably, sipping wine under blazing torches. They never had to cover their hearths. You, however, as a peasant, could lose an entire week's wages if a single ember glowed past the final bell. When true night descended, the medieval world transformed into something entirely different. No lamps, no light, only thick, suffocating darkness filled with the eerie sounds of the night. Rats scurrying in the rafters, dogs howling in the yard, wind slipping through cracks in the walls like ghostly whispers. Want to read? Impossible. Want to sew? No one dared to sew in the dark unless they wished to stab their own hands. The world after the curfew bell was a world frozen in stillness. Yet the darkness was not only against fire, it was against people. When the night kept everyone too afraid to step outside, the drunks, thieves, and wanderers had fewer chances to roam. The authorities called it order through darkness. If they could not teach obedience, they would at least teach fear of the night. Even so, in the larger towns, people sometimes found ways around the rules. Some cracked open cellar doors, lighting small torches covered with animal hide so the glow would not escape. Some towns even had fire watchers, guards who patrolled after the bell, inspecting rooftops, sniffing for smoke. Just a hint of warm ash, and you could be dragged into the town square for punishment. But if we step back and look closer, there was a strange kind of wisdom in that harshness. The medieval world was fragile as dry grass. No plumbing, no fire brigade, no brick walls. When everything around you was made of wood and straw, surviving one fireless night was already a small miracle. And perhaps, somewhere between the final toll of the bell and the silence of the dark, people of that time learned how to survive through collective discipline. They put out their fires not only because they feared the law, but because they knew that a spark in their home could burn down their neighbors as well. So you lie down, listening to the breath of rats above the beams and the wind moaning through the cracks. You pull a coarse wool blanket up to your chest, shivering, then smile bitterly to yourself. Somewhere out there in the fields, nobles are probably drinking by a roaring fire, and you are doing the lawful thing, trembling in the cold, saving the whole village from the warmth you were never allowed to keep. Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we open the door to a world both strange and fascinating, the Middle Ages, an era where laws and customs existed among grand castles, endless plagues, and the smoky scent of burning wood that filled the air. The rules you are about to hear may sound absurd to us now, but in the context of hundreds of years ago, amid mud, superstition, and the desperate will to survive, they were, in their own way, terrifyingly reasonable. Before we begin, if you truly enjoy history told in this way, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss our next journeys through time. And I would really love to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Leave a comment below. It is always fascinating to see people traveling through history together from all around the world. Now then, Turn off the lights, let a gentle fan hum, or play a soft background tune. Tonight we are going to explore the strange laws, the unbelievable prohibitions, and the ways they shaped human life in the Middle Ages. A world both dark and radiant in its own mysterious way. In the medieval world, fashion was not a matter of taste. It was a matter of government policy. These so-called sumptuary laws clearly dictated who was allowed to wear what. It was society's way of making sure everyone looked exactly like the rank they belonged to. If you were a peasant, your clothes had to be made of rough brown wool, thick and itchy enough to make you question God's mercy. Meanwhile, nobles strutted down the streets wrapped in bright, shimmering silk, glowing as if they had just bathed in unicorn blood. They dressed not just to look good, but to remind the world of exactly who they were. Try to imitate them, and the consequences would come faster than you could imagine. The authorities might fine you, publicly humiliate you, or in worse cases throw you into prison, all because your cloak looked too noble. There, in the damp darkness where rats gnawed on boots, you would realize that the price of fashion could very well be your freedom. But these sumptuary laws were not random. Small details, like the color purple reserved only for royalty, or the white ermine fur allowed only on garments of the titled, were instruments of power. These rules ensured that social order remained clear and unshaken, that no one dared to dream beyond their station. Because if a peasant could dress like a noble, what would stop him from thinking he deserved to be treated like one? Even shoes carried social meaning. The nobles wore poulain shoes, with toes so long they had to be tied to their knees to avoid tripping. Ridiculous? Absolutely. But that was the point. Their impracticality proved that the wearer was rich enough not to work. You, on the other hand, as a peasant, were allowed only simple, sturdy boots, practical and plain, just like your life. Behind those strange rules was a quiet fear among the elite, the fear of being mistaken for the poor. In a world where power and bloodline were expressed through appearance, dressing above your station was a direct threat. If a merchant could look like a noble, the hierarchy could crumble. And of course, there was also an economic reason. The aristocracy did not want commoners spending money on silk, jewels, or wine, luxuries they saw as wasteful excess. The government wanted peasants to use their earnings to pay taxes, rent their land, and live humbly. To them, dressing beautifully while being poor was like stealing the dignity of the rich. Ironically, some people still dared to take the risk. Records from 14th century England mention craftsmen fined for sewing fur trims onto their coats, and merchants' wives punished by having their forbidden lace borders cut off. In Florence, actual fashion police roamed the streets, checking sleeve lengths and fabric types to make sure no one broke the law. Yet behind all that strictness lay a familiar collective mindset. Medieval society feared change. Every thread, every color was a soft barrier that kept the lower classes from climbing upward. In a world without television, payrolls, or social media, your clothes were the only social ID you had. So that morning, you still had to put on your coarse brown wool tunic, tie your worn-out shoes, and step into the street carrying the quiet resignation of your time. Because in that world, the greatest crime was not theft, rebellion, or heresy. It was daring to look too beautiful when you were not allowed to.